Hello everyone and welcome to Sherlock Tales. I'm thrilled to have you with me for this unique and immersive long-form mystery. As always, tell me, where are you watching from and what time is it for you right now? Now, let us dim the lights, prepare a warm drink, and turn the page into another hidden chapter of Baker Street's legendary archive. I've been away from Baker Street for scarcely 3 days, having visited an old army colleague in Colchester, when I returned to find Holmes seated at his desk in complete silence. His long fingers were interlaced beneath his chin, and he stared not at his usual chemical apparatus, or his Persian slipper full of tobacco, but at what appeared to be an old, scorched map and a pile of torn vellum pages. He did not look up as I entered. "You're precisely 48 minutes late, Watson," he said without malice. "For what appointment?" I asked, shrugging off my coat. "For an expedition," he replied, still staring at the documents on the desk. "Or rather, an exhumation of a sort, if you are willing." Holmes gestured to the pile before him. I stepped forward and caught the unmistakable scent of age, dust, ash, and old ink. "Where did these come from?" I asked, peering more closely. "They were mailed to me," he replied, rising. "No return address, no explanation. Arrived 3 days ago in a box wrapped in oilskin and sealed with the crest of a long-defunct literary society known as the Inkstone Covenant." I blinked. Never heard of them. "Precisely why it interests me." He handed me a page. It was written in florid, archaic script, parts of it illegible, others crossed out violently. Yet at the top, one line stood out. "The true authorship of A Study in Scarlet lies buried beneath the Thames." Holmes smiled faintly at my reaction. "Droll, isn't it? Someone is either attempting a literary hoax or they possess a knowledge of history far deeper than they ought." "Do you believe it?" I asked. Holmes tapped the scorched map. "I believe we're being led somewhere, carefully, deliberately, and with a purpose, and the game is already afoot." Over the next hour, Holmes explained that the parchment pages, though appearing ancient, had been chemically aged, a mixture of potassium, permanganate, and glycerol, if he was correct. They referenced names we both knew: Joseph Bell, Arthur Conan Doyle, even Langdale Pike, the gossip-monger Holmes occasionally consulted. But the true mystery was in the map. "It overlays almost perfectly with the Eastern Sewer Network of London," Holmes said, tapping 2 overlapping folds. "But this symbol here," he pointed to a 3-headed quill, "does not appear on any municipal chart." "Then it was added later," I said. "Indeed, by someone who knows what the city forgot." The following morning we descended into the tunnels beneath Clerkenwell with lanterns, hip waders, and revolvers in hand. The sewer system, despite its modernisation under Sir Joseph Bazalgette, still retained corners of Victorian gloom. Arched brickwork dripping with condensation, iron ladders slick with rust, and the faint metallic tang of old blood in the air. We followed Holmes's marked route, turning at precise junctions he calculated from the burns and creases in the map. At precisely the 3rd hour of our subterranean march, Holmes halted. Before us, a brick wall had partially collapsed, revealing a small chamber behind it, no more than 5 feet in depth and cloaked in ancient cobwebs. Within, half buried in detritus, was a leather-bound book encased in a rusted iron frame. Holmes retrieved it with care. Its cover bore no title, only a deep branded mark of 3 quills crossing at the base. "The Inkstone Covenant," Holmes murmured. We brought the object back to Baker Street and examined it under lamplight. The lock on the frame was sophisticated, likely custom forged and protected by a mechanism Holmes described as diabolically clever. Only after applying heat to the hinge and inserting a narrow steel probe did it give way. The manuscript inside was written in multiple hands. Some pages were personal letters, others annotated minutes from clandestine meetings. But what struck us most were the signatures, among them TCD, JB, MW, and chillingly SH. Holmes went perfectly still. "Watson," he said slowly, "someone has forged my initials, or they know something about me I do not." A knock at the door interrupted us. It was Mrs. Hudson, trembling. "A gentleman's here to see you, Mr. Holmes," she said. "Says he's from the British Museum, but he wouldn't give a name." Holmes exchanged a glance with me and stood. "Let him in." The man who entered was tall, gaunt, with sallow eyes and a voice like paper tearing. He offered no greeting, only a parchment card with a sigil embossed in gold. "If the covenant has been disturbed, the sentence is silence." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Is that a threat?" The man gave a thin smile. "It is a reminder." Then just as suddenly he turned and departed. For several minutes we said nothing. Then Holmes sat back and steepled his fingers again. "Well, Watson, the covenant lives, the manuscript breathes. And apparently we are now at odds with a secret literary society that may have rewritten more than fiction." He reached for his pipe. "This is no longer a case, it is a war of authorship." The following day, Holmes left our rooms without word or explanation. When I inquired with Mrs. Hudson as to his whereabouts, she only said he had been gone since dawn and had taken that dreadful-looking manuscript with him. I occupied myself with some modest, patient notes and a troubled conscience. I knew Holmes well enough to sense that what we had found had struck something deep. He returned after nightfall, drenched from a downpour and with mud caked to his cuffs. Yet his eyes gleamed. "We were right, Watson," he said, slinging off his coat. "The Inkstone Covenant is not a fantasy. They operated for nearly a century under the guise of a literary circle hosted inside a small banking chamber on Threadneedle Street. Their founder was none other than Montague Wetherell, failed barrister and rumoured occultist." I sat upright. Montague Wetherell, the same Wetherell who disappeared in 1872 under allegations of libel and manuscript theft. "The very same," Holmes replied. "Only the theft was no mere act of literary jealousy. He was accused of stealing the unpublished memoirs of multiple authors, including Charles Dickens himself. Now, follow me." He laid out an ornate map of central London on the floor. Small markings in ink formed a rough triangle connecting three obscure locations: the former site of the Threadneedle Literary Club, a shuttered printing press in Lambeth, and a burned-down estate on the edge of Hampstead Heath. "Each of these," Holmes said, "is mentioned repeatedly in the manuscript we found beneath Clerkenwell. The writers were not merely composing fiction, they were editing reality, rewriting history through narrative." My brow furrowed. "That sounds dangerously close to delusion, Holmes." "So it does," he replied. "But suppose they believed it? Suppose they thought the written word could be used to shape perception, and by extension, memory? Imagine a group of elite minds, historians, poets, editors, bound by oath to suppress or reassign authorship, to ensure certain ideas were attributed not to their creators, but to chosen vessels. You're describing something like propaganda. No, Watson, I'm describing control of the cultural record by a cabal who understood that the future remembers what the present agrees to record. At that, Holmes removed a folded letter from his pocket. It appears I've been invited to their archives, he said. Tonight. I stiffened. Surely not alone? Alone is the only way they'll agree. I am to meet a certain scribe beneath a warehouse in Blackfriars. You can't be serious, Holmes. This could be a trap. It could, he admitted, which is why I shall need you not far behind. Armed. That night we took separate cabs, Holmes alighting first in the shadow of a soot-covered warehouse off Water Lane. I watched from a distance, revolver concealed under my coat. He knocked once, then twice, and a hidden door creaked open. A figure cloaked in a waxed cape gestured for him to enter. Holmes disappeared inside. I waited 5 minutes, then approached from the alley, eyes keen for any sign of distress. Finding an alternate entrance, I slipped through a side door and crept into the building's undercroft. What I found took my breath away. It was a chamber unlike any I'd seen, half library, half crypt. The walls were lined with sealed bookcases, each bearing names I recognized: Shelley, Tennyson, Darwin, even Byron. And at the centre stood Holmes, in conversation with a man seated at a long table. The man was elderly, yet sharp-eyed. He bore a tattoo on his right hand, 3 quills and a ring. I am the scribe, he said, and what you possess is dangerous. Holmes smiled thinly. Which part? The book, or the knowledge of its existence? The scribe ignored the question. You were not meant to find it. The Covenant's work was concluded years ago. Concluded, Holmes said slowly. Yet you remain. The scribe paused. There is one final matter, one last manuscript, and it bears your name, Mr. Holmes. He pulled out a scroll from a black case. My heart leapt. The seal on it was the same sigil we had seen in the underground chamber. The 3 quills. He unravelled it slowly, deliberately. The title struck us both dumb. The Final Case of Sherlock Holmes. Holmes read in silence. His face shifted from irritation to puzzlement to something I had never seen before. Doubt. I didn't write this, he said flatly. Of course not, said the scribe. We did, in anticipation of your final act. Holmes looked up, eyes cold. You presume to write my death? The scribe answered only with a soft, chilling sentence. We did not write your death, Mr. Holmes. We wrote your replacement. The candlelight flickered. A sound echoed from deeper within the stacks. A scrape of chair legs, a breath not our own. I drew my revolver and stepped into view. Holmes didn't even flinch. The scribe turned toward me and offered a slow, respectful nod. Ah, the chronicler, the final custos. Holmes took the scroll from the table and backed away. No more games, he said. Whatever you have planned ends now. The scribe only smiled. It has already begun. We left without resistance, but I knew Holmes was shaken, not by fear, but by the terrible precision of the writing in that scroll. It knew things about him even I did not. And somewhere deep in the bowels of London, a manuscript existed that claimed to know how his story would end. The manuscript, titled The Final Case of Sherlock Holmes, remained locked inside Holmes's iron safe for 3 full days before he agreed to examine it again. He made no mention of it in our conversations, nor did he refer again to the scribe or the Inkstone Covenant. I could see, however, that the scroll's existence weighed on him heavily. He rose earlier, slept less, played the violin for no more than a few seconds at a time, before putting it down and staring blankly at the gaslight flickering on our ceiling. Then, on the fourth day, he spoke. "Watson, I am being authored." I blinked. "Come again?" Holmes did not look at me. He stood at the window, hands behind his back. "Each of my cases has been subject to narrative influence. Yours, mine, even Lestrade's. But this," he gestured toward the safe, "this is not a case written after the fact. It is one being written in advance. Someone is scripting not only what I've done, but what I'm meant to do." I was silent a long moment. Then I asked the only question I could. "Do you believe it?" Holmes turned to me with unusual hesitation in his voice. "I do not know, Watson, and that is what terrifies me." Later that morning, he asked me to accompany him to the reading room of the British Museum, under the pretense of studying anonymous publishing archives. In truth, he wished to consult a woman known only as the archivist, an eccentric former Cambridge historian who had disappeared from academia years earlier and now managed an unofficial, off-the-record catalogue of unpublished manuscripts. We were led to her by a young clerk who warned us. She prefers silence. She also despises fiction, so speak plainly. We found her in a hidden annex deep within the bowels of the building, surrounded by folios bound in faded cloth, a magnifying lens strapped to her temple like a jeweller's loop. Her fingers were stained black with ink. "Mr. Holmes," she said without rising, "and Dr. Watson. I have waited some time." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "You were informed of our coming?" She smirked. "Not informed. Written." She produced a single parchment and handed it to Holmes. It read, "They will come, the one who doubts and the one who records. They will ask about the dagger. You must give it to them." "M.W. Montague Wetherell," Holmes whispered. The archivist nodded. "He was a genius and mad. He believed that symbols, when properly bound to narrative, could reshape the course of real events. That's what the Covenant was built on. And this," she reached beneath her desk and brought forth a long black velvet box, "was his final design." She opened the lid. Inside lay a dagger. No ordinary blade. This one was thin, almost surgical, with an etched handle of engraved brass. The words running down its side read, "That which is unwritten may not bleed." Holmes reached out, then paused. "This is the symbolic instrument mentioned in the scroll," he said. The archivist nodded again. "They called it the editor's blade. Allegedly it was never used to kill, but to erase names, faces, fragments of memory, entire paragraphs of personal history, struck from continuity like ink removed from a page." I stared at the dagger, uneasy. "You believe this is metaphor?" She stared straight at me. "I stopped believing in metaphor when I found my own name missing from university rosters, where I had taught for 15 years. Holmes took the dagger in his gloved hand and studied it. "It's cold," he muttered. "Too cold for brass." Then his eyes narrowed. "There's something beneath the etching." He held the blade near the flame of a gas lamp, revealing a second line hidden by oxidation. "Property of S.H." "Sherlock Holmes," I said aloud. "No," Holmes replied, his voice low. "Simon Hatherley." He placed the dagger down with care. Hatherley was a newspaper editor in 1883, vanished after exposing a plagiarism ring within the Royal Society. His last article was redacted before print. The archivist nodded. Wetherell tried to bring him into the Covenant. He refused, so they rewrote him out of the record. But he left clues, most of them encoded into footnotes and annotations in public obituaries. Holmes looked at her sharply. "You've seen them?" She nodded once. "And there's more, in a private archive under St. Paul's Cathedral, only accessible through the Whispering Gallery. Wetherell believed sound could carry memory, and that certain echoes preserved unauthorized versions of history." Holmes lit a cigarette. "Then our next destination is a cathedral's echo." Before we departed, the archivist stopped Holmes. "You are part of the record now. They will not simply erase you, they will overwrite you." Holmes stared back. "I have fought assassins, anarchists, and kings. Let them try." She said nothing more, only handed him a sealed envelope with one word on it: "For the final scene." As we left the museum, Holmes pocketed the dagger. "Watson," he said, "we're not chasing a criminal anymore. We're chasing an edit. Someone is carving a new history while erasing the old. And if we do not act the story they write..." He paused. "Won't include us at all." A Sherlock Holmes-style mystery section, 4 of 10, The Echo Ledger. We arrived at St. Paul's Cathedral on a rainless, windless Sunday morning, one of those rare English days so still and silent it feels as though time is listening. The great dome towered above us like a monolith of thought, its stones worn smooth by centuries of footsteps and whispered prayers. Holmes had arranged, through less than official channels, for us to be alone inside the Whispering Gallery. An elliptical ring suspended above the cathedral's central crossing. Its peculiar acoustics allow a whisper on one side to be heard clearly at the other. But we were not there to test sound. We were there to find what the Covenant had hidden within it. We climbed the 259 steps in silence. Holmes carried the editor's dagger in a wrapped cloth, and I carried a lantern and notebook. The cathedral was entirely empty, save for a distant verger, polishing brass well out of earshot. At the top, Holmes led me to a specific point along the gallery's curve, marked on the scorched map retrieved with the manuscript. He tapped the stone 3 times, nothing, then once more, softer. A tone reverberated behind the wall. "Holmes, what is that?" I whispered. He knelt and placed his ear to the panelling. "It's not the wall that's echoing. It's a chamber." To our astonishment, Holmes located a faint seam in the marble near the balustrade, a false panel no larger than a writing desk. He produced a fine-tipped blade, not the editor's but one of his own design, and worked it carefully into the seam. With a faint click, the panel swung inward. Inside was a narrow alcove lined with shelves, and one small desk covered in a thin sheet of oilcloth. On it sat a book, bound in deep red leather, stamped with the symbol of 3 crossed quills. Holmes removed it and opened the cover. At the top of the first page, "The Echo Ledger, Compendium of Events, Rewritten or Denied." We scanned the index. Dates, locations, names. Many had been struck through. Others annotated in faint ink. Hatherley's Exposé, 1883, redacted. Lucinda Moore, true author of Clockwork London, reassigned. Death of E. Hargreaves, 1891, unexplained reversal. Then in the lower margin of one page we found a familiar set of initials. S.H. Holmes's face tightened. Page 231, he murmured. We turned to it. There, in careful calligraphy, was an account dated 2 years in the future. At the turn of the year 1896, Sherlock Holmes will be found deceased near the banks of the Thames. No body, no witnesses. Cause attributed to drowning. Investigation closed without resolution. Final record transcribed by an anonymous author within the Covenant. I stared in horror. Holmes, this is your death. No, Watson, he said quietly. This is someone else's version of it. We took the Echo Ledger and descended in haste, returning to Baker Street by hansom. Once there, Holmes locked the book inside a steel cabinet and paced furiously for nearly an hour. They are not merely changing literature, he said at last. They are orchestrating real events, removing inconvenient lives by way of carefully constructed narrative erasure. He pointed at the dagger. That blade is not a murder weapon. It is a symbolic tool, a signature, a closing parenthesis to a rewritten sentence of reality. The next day we set out for Lambeth, the second point in the inkstone triangle Holmes had marked earlier. There, hidden behind a decaying storefront, stood a forgotten printworks named Torrance and Sons, last registered in 1879. Inside, all was ruin. Dust lay in thick blankets over the presses. The air reeked of ink and mildew. But behind a false wall we uncovered a locked compartment. Holmes used a chisel and crowbar, and after much effort forced it open. Inside were hundreds of plates, metal etchings, typeset in mirror image. Each one bore the beginning of a different article or short story. Many were famous, but the bylines were wrong. "Darwin," I murmured, holding one. "This article was published under his name." Holmes examined another. But this plate bears the name of R.J. Hollins, an amateur biologist, likely the original author. I stared at the stacks. "You're telling me the Covenant ran a secret press for correcting public attribution?" "Correcting or rewriting, depending on their interests," Holmes said. "They stole, modified, and reassigned ideas, and over decades their record replaced the original truth." At that moment a noise came from behind the presses. Holmes signalled me to be still and drew his revolver. We advanced cautiously. A figure darted out from the shadows, thin, bespectacled, barely out of adolescence. He raised his hands in surrender. "Please," he said, "don't shoot. I didn't know anyone else knew." Holmes narrowed his eyes. "And who are you?" The young man swallowed. "My name is Colin Wetherell, great-grandson of Montague. I'm an apprentice archivist, and the Covenant is trying to erase me next." We brought Colin back to Baker Street. There, under Holmes's sharp inquiry, he revealed everything. "The Covenant fell apart 10 years ago," he said. "Internal fracture. Some wanted to disband, others wanted to expand. Rewrite everything, not just authorship. Lives, relationships, obituaries. They started calling it narrative engineering. My great-grandfather fled, took what he could, and hid manuscripts in secret locations." "And you?" I asked. I found part of his journal. Been searching ever since. But someone's watching me now. I've had entire letters disappear mid-delivery. Friends forget my name. My lease voided without cause. Holmes stood over him. Then you've come to the right place. Later, Holmes told me privately, Colin is our link to the remaining Covenant members. If we can protect him, we may discover their final archive. I asked the obvious question. And if we don't? Holmes's reply was quiet. Then the version of reality we know may be overwritten for good. Colin Wetherell spent the night in our guest room, too nervous to sleep and too afraid to leave. He barely spoke over breakfast except to ask Holmes whether his name would survive the week. Holmes gave no answer. Instead, he unfurled the Echo Ledger once again and opened to a section titled Custodial Entries. Dozens of pages were filled with annotated names, each bearing a red stamp beside it. Erased, rewritten, preserved. Only 13 names bore the last designation. Holmes pointed to them, tracing his finger down the ink. "This," he murmured, "is the list of those the Covenant could not rewrite." The names included literary critics, archivists, even a disgraced chemist, but it was the final name that drew our breath. 13th, Jonathan Verlaine, status unknown, location Ormo Asylum. Verlaine? I asked. The poet. No, Holmes replied, though the name is no coincidence. This man was once a forensic archivist for the Crown, obsessed with authorship fraud. Rumours say he went mad after uncovering a manuscript supposedly written by Queen Victoria. Colin leaned forward. The 13th. He's in the original Covenant documents. Holmes turned to him. You've seen those? Colin nodded. Fragments, hidden in marginalia. He was the only Custos who voted against the Covenant's transformation into what it became. Then we must speak to him, Holmes said, already standing. If Verlaine still remembers what he tried to preserve, we may finally learn what they erased from you, Colin. Ormo Asylum lay in the outskirts of Hampstead, behind a high stone wall and a wrought-iron gate that creaked like an old violin. Its director, a prim man named Doctor Kelshaw, greeted us with reluctance. Verlaine is not a patient we encourage visits with, he said, twirling his pen. He believes the world is a library and everyone in it a stolen page. Then we may get along famously, Holmes replied. We were led down echoing halls and past barred rooms, until we reached a door bolted from the outside. Dr. Kelshaw unlocked it with theatrical care. Inside sat a man who might have once been regal, a long-bearded, hollow-eyed figure with ink-stained hands and books piled in a fortress around him. He looked up as we entered and grinned with far too many teeth. Well, well, Sherlock Holmes, Dr. Watson, and... oh, the boy whose name keeps vanishing. Colin froze. You know me? Verlaine nodded. I knew your great-grandfather. He tried to save the truth. You're the loose thread they've been trying to snip. Holmes stepped forward. Mr. Verlaine, we found the ledger. We found the blade. We believe the Covenant is trying to overwrite the present through narrative edits. Verlaine laughed softly. They're not trying, dear man. They're doing ... Every week, a life gets snipped, then stitched back under a new name, a new story, a new role. They don't need bullets or poison. They use paragraphs, period. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded page, yellowed with age. I've been waiting for someone to ask about this. It was a copy of a Covenant decree stamped in crimson. Initiative Veritas Clause. Should any Custos violate the integrity of the record, a final narrative override will be authorized. The overwritten will become the overwritten. The story must go on. Signed, S.H. and J.V. Holmes went cold. You signed this." Verlaine nodded. Before I understood what it truly meant, before I realized they weren't preserving truth, they were substituting it. Holmes turned the page over. On the reverse was a list of 13 names. The last had been scratched out violently. Underneath it, in faint red ink, a new one had been added. 14th, John H. Watson. I stared at the ink as if it might catch fire. "Why, me?" Verlaine's voice turned grave. "Because you're the scribe, the one they missed, the one who records what isn't meant to be remembered, the stories they couldn't control. You wrote them into permanence." He fixed Holmes with a knowing look. "You've always been the instrument, Mr. Holmes, but Watson is the ink." We left the asylum with heavy steps. Holmes was quieter than I had seen him in days. Back at Baker Street, he locked the page in the safe beside the ledger and turned to me. "You see what this means?" "I do," I said. "They're not after you, Holmes. They're after me." He nodded. "But to reach you, they must first rewrite me." Colin, meanwhile, had retrieved from his belongings a slip of brittle paper he'd once discovered inside the lining of Montague Wetherell's travelling bag. It appeared to be a coded address, coordinates linked to a forgotten estate south of Croydon. "Wetherell's final archive," he said. He called it the last draft. Holmes drew a deep breath. "Then that is where we go next. And if we are to put an end to the Covenant's rewriting, we must find the original manuscript, the one that predates their edits." I raised my glass. "To the last draft, then." Holmes clinked it gently. "To the last story that cannot be changed. A Sherlock Holmes-style mystery section 6 of 10, the last draft." We set out before first light, taking a rented carriage south toward Croydon. The air was chill, the sky bruised with dawn, and not one of us spoke much as the wheels clattered over frost-laced cobblestones. Holmes remained deep in concentration, occasionally sketching glyphs from the Echo Ledger into his notebook. Colin Wetherell stared out the window, and I confess my hands shook slightly. They had written me into the Covenant's page, but I would not let them write my end. The coordinates led us to an overgrown field beyond a collapsed windmill, where brambles had overtaken the path and frost glittered on the roots like buried glass. A ruin stood at the field's edge, once an estate house, now roofless, its foundations split and half swallowed by ivy. Holmes examined the ruins with care. The architecture suggests late Georgian, modified in 1835. The southwest corner's collapse reveals a crypt beneath the foundation, possibly an old cellar or scriptorium. "How can you tell that?" I asked. He pointed to the moss-covered stones. "Chisel marks. This wall was reinforced from within. Someone didn't want it falling outward." We cleared the rubble and discovered a stairwell choked with debris. It took hours to excavate it. At last, we descended into a cold, subterranean chamber lined with cracked tiles, wooden beams darkened with rot. A central platform held an iron pedestal. On it sat a single object wrapped in layers of oilcloth. Colin stepped forward with trembling fingers and unwrapped it. A manuscript, bound in oxblood leather. Its cover bore no title, only a circular embossing of the 3 quills broken at their stems. Holmes exhaled. The last draft period. We returned to Baker Street at dusk, Holmes carrying the manuscript as one might a crown. Once inside, he bolted the door, drew the curtains, and set the book on the table between us. "Gentlemen," he said, "let us read what could not be rewritten." The opening pages were surprisingly simple. an epistolary introduction by Montague Wetherell himself. To the custos who outlast the edits, know this record is uncut, uncorrected, unclaimed by any pen but mine. Within are the true authors, the true erasures, and the map to the Covenant's final narrative act, what they called Concordia Noctis. That phrase appeared again and again throughout the pages. Concordia Noctis, the harmony of night. It was the Covenant's final goal, a project described in oblique but chilling terms. They were not merely reassigning authorship, they intended to create a singular unified narrative reality, one in which memory, literature, and history aligned under a master text. A dominant fiction, an overlay that would become truth simply by being repeated often enough. They believe reality is a story, Holmes murmured, and that if they write it convincingly, the world will follow suit. The final third of the manuscript listed names, some crossed out, some preserved. We recognized many. One had a dagger symbol beside it. J.H.W. Watson. That's my second entry, I said. They've marked me for elimination. Holmes' eyes did not leave the page. Not elimination. You've already been erased once. They mean to replace you. I stiffened. Whom? Colin cleared his throat. There's mention here of a figure called the Red Pen, a replacement custos, someone the Covenant selects when the original chronicler is removed. Holmes tapped the margin. There, a footnote. It read, "The Red Pen shall be introduced via narrative necessity, bonded to the protagonist. Their presence will feel inevitable." The implications were horrifying. A replacement chronicler would replace me in memory, slide into the past as though they'd always been there, shaping every case, every detail. My accounts would vanish like frost in the sun. Holmes looked me dead in the eye. "Watson, if they succeed, I will forget you." We sat in silence. Then Holmes rose, hands trembling slightly. I swore I would never let the truth be altered by cowardice or convenience. That vow extends to you. We will not let them rewrite you. He turned to Colin. "This project, Concordia Noctis, where is it housed?" Colin flipped through the final page. "There's a cipher," he said, "but I don't know how to decode it. It's a composite of initials, narrative glyphs, and something that looks like musical notation." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "I know someone who can." The next day, we travelled to the estate of Langdale Pike, the notorious gossip columnist and information broker, whose knowledge of London's shadowed elite was second only to Holmes's. His manor overlooked the Thames, its walls lined with scandal, confession, and blackmail. He greeted us in a dressing gown with one of his usual smirks. "Well, well, the detective and the doomed narrator, what a delightful pairing." Holmes ignored the jibe. "We need a cipher decoded. You've seen Wetherell's glyphs before." Pike took the page, peered at it, and smiled faintly. "Oh, yes. This is from the Concordia tablature period." "What's that?" I asked. He twirled his finger. "It's how the Covenant encoded location through narrative rhythm. The glyphs form a sequence of stress patterns, beats. When translated, they match to a phrase." He hummed it softly, then spoke, "The place where fiction ends and silence begins." Holmes stood. "Pike? Where would that be?" Pike raised an eyebrow. "Oh, my dear man, that's simple." He leaned closer. "The Royal Necropolis at Brookwood." We departed immediately. Holmes was already sketching plans. They intend to bury the master narrative beneath the largest cemetery in England, because what better place to hide the story of all stories than among the dead? Colin nodded slowly. It's there. The Concordia Noctis, the manuscript that rewrites everything. If we do not retrieve it, the world that remains may no longer be ours. Holmes's eyes were ice. Then we'll dig it up, paragraph by paragraph, until there's nothing left to hide. Brookwood Cemetery, known as the London Necropolis, sprawled across nearly 2,000 acres. Established in the 1850s, it had become not only the resting place of the forgotten, but also, according to Holmes, the ideal location for the Covenant's final archive. We arrived at dusk. A fog drifted low across the mossy gravestones. The old railway line that once carried the dead from Waterloo Station had long since stopped running, but the tracks remained, rusted, overgrown, and leading deep into the burial fields. Holmes disembarked from the carriage with the precision of a man arriving for an appointment rather than an intrusion. Colin Wetherell adjusted the straps of his satchel nervously. They'll know we're here. I expect so, Holmes replied, and I intend to make them regret that knowledge. We entered through a broken gate near the Catholic enclosure. Holmes had learned through Langdale Pike that a disused crypt, originally belonging to a family named Hargreaves, had become the Covenant's subterranean archive. The tomb's inscription had been worn away by time, but Holmes found the crest beneath the moss, a quill broken at the nib. Here, he said. I helped him lever the rusted doors open. Inside lay a narrow staircase spiralling downward into pitch darkness. We descended, lanterns in hand. The passage opened into a cavernous hall, but this was no ordinary crypt. It was a library, a necro-archive, its shelves carved into the stone itself, each niche filled with scrolls, books, and sealed boxes bearing sigils we recognized from the Echo Ledger and the Last Draft. The smell of age and paper filled the air. Holmes ran his fingers along the spines. These are versions, he said. Alternate lives, stories that once were true and were replaced. I opened a box at random. Inside lay a manuscript titled The Man Who Shot Queen Victoria. I thought she died of illness. She did, Colin said softly, but perhaps once she didn't. At the far end of the hall stood a lectern, and on it, bound in jet black leather, was a massive tome. Unlabelled, Holmes approached it with reverence and caution. He placed one gloved hand on the cover. This, he said, is Concordia Noctis. We gathered around as he opened it. The pages were written in elegant script, but the text shimmered faintly, as though resisting our eyes. Each entry described events as they were meant to be, but not as they happened. 1891, Sherlock Holmes perishes at Reichenbach Falls. 1888, John H. Watson never returns from Afghanistan. 1895, Queen Victoria abdicates under scandal. 1900, the empire dissolves without conflict. Holmes turned the page. There, written in red ink, 1901, the last custos, John H. Watson, is replaced. The world forgets him. Concordia is complete. I stared at the words. The manuscript had already recorded my erasure. Holmes reached the final pages blank. No ink, no names, only faint grooves like guide marks for future entries. They're planning the next overwrites, he whispered. The pages are prepared, waiting to be written. Colin stepped back. pale. "If they finish this, Holmes, no one will remember any of us." Holmes's jaw clenched. "Then we won't let them finish." A sudden voice echoed from the entrance behind us. "You're too late." We turned. A woman stood there, wrapped in a cloak the colour of ash. Her eyes gleamed with conviction. She was followed by two others, both wearing silver pins shaped like closed books. Holmes stepped forward. "Let me guess. The editors." She nodded. "We maintain the record. We correct the distortions. You are the distortion, Mr. Holmes. Your continued resistance has threatened the integrity of the master narrative." I stood tall. "And what of me?" She turned to me. "You are an anomaly. A chronicler who insists on remembering versions we buried long ago." She reached into her cloak. From it she drew a red pen. No metaphor, the red pen, a tool and a title. "You will be replaced," she said, "not by violence, by consensus. The world will simply forget you ever existed." She stepped toward the lectern. Holmes raised the editor's dagger and levelled it at her. "Touch that book and I swear—" She froze. The dagger glinted in the lantern light. "Ah," she said, "the symbolic instrument. How quaint. You think to cut the story itself?" Holmes narrowed his eyes. "Number, I think, to cut the author." Suddenly from the shelves a dozen masked figures emerged. Editors, narrators, redactors. We were surrounded. I drew my revolver. Colin pulled from his satchel the original last draft and raised it like a shield. And then Holmes moved. He lunged toward the lectern, seized the Concordia Noctis, and drew the dagger across its spine. A scream, not human, not physical, rang through the chamber. The manuscript bled ink, literally. Black rivulets spilled onto the floor as the pages writhed in protest. The editors cried out, some collapsed. Others fled into the stacks, their pins falling like dead leaves. The woman dropped her red pen. She gasped. "You've undone the harmony." Holmes stepped over the bleeding tome. There was never harmony, only silence mistaken for peace. He turned to me. "Watson, write it." I nodded, pulled out my notebook and began recording. Every word, every act as it truly happened. Holmes approached the woman once more. "You may rewrite the future, but not this moment. This one is mine." We burned Concordia Noctis that night, page by page, its ashes scattered into the Thames. Colin watched them drift away. "They'll try again," he said softly. "Yes," Holmes replied, "but now the truth knows how to fight back." I nodded grimly, still reeling from what we had seen. Even as I tried to etch the memory of the Concordia Noctis into my own mind, I could feel how fragile that memory already was. "It's like it's slipping," I whispered, "like I'm remembering a dream more than a moment." Holmes gave me a long, tired look. "That is the Covenant's greatest weapon. Not ink, doubt." For the next 3 days, Baker Street became a war room. We mapped out every name recorded in the Echo Ledger and Last Draft. Holmes cross-referenced them with archival databases, obituary registers, and university rolls. More often than not, the names yielded nothing. No records, no relatives, no memory. It was as if their very existences had been filed away. "Look at this," Holmes said on the second evening. He pointed to a name that appeared multiple times. E. Hargreaves. Again, I asked. We saw that name back at the British Museum. And again in the Echo Ledger, but not as a single person. It appears in multiple contexts, each one separated by a decade. Holmes gestured to the timelines he'd drawn across the chalkboard. 1 Hargreaves was a chemist in 1871. Another was a publisher in 1883. Then a political aide in 1890. Each instance ends abruptly, erased or replaced. You believe they're the same person? No, he said, eyes sharp. I believe E. Hargreaves is a synthetic identity, a placeholder used by the Covenant to insert agents into the narrative flow without attracting attention. I felt the hairs rise on my neck. You're saying there's not one Hargreaves? There could be dozens? Holmes nodded. Which means they didn't just overwrite individuals. They invented them. That night, I awoke to find Holmes already dressed. Come, Watson, he said. The game has resumed. He led me to the British Library, specifically the rare manuscripts room, where he had arranged an unsanctioned midnight visit through favours owed and secrets held. Waiting inside was Colin Wetherell. He held a slim black case. I recovered this from my great-grandfather's effects, he whispered. He called it the Inkling, a device used by the early Covenant to detect narrative inconsistencies. He opened the case. Inside was a thin glass rod, wrapped in copper filament and fitted to a brass cylinder that buzzed faintly when passed over certain papers. Watch. He waved the Inkling over a file labelled Naval Deployment Logs 1889. The rod vibrated, and the tip glowed red. False, Holmes said. Not necessarily false, Colin corrected, but tampered with. We tested 25 documents that night. 17 glowed red. Most were mundane, bank ledgers, shipping logs, employee rosters. But one dash. A letter from the Prime Minister to Queen Victoria regarding the foundation of the British Museum's memory room was marked in double red. Holmes's brow furrowed. This is it, he said. A node, a fixed point of control. If the Covenant ever had a headquarters, it wasn't a building. It was a narrative authority structure embedded in official records. I stared at the page. But that letter's dated 1872. If they've had that much time. Holmes closed the case with finality. Then we are not fighting to preserve the past, Watson. We are fighting to rescue it. The next morning, an envelope arrived. It bore no return address. Inside was a single page typewritten. You burned one draft. There are others. Ink cannot stop idea. The editor lives. S.H. Holmes studied the signature. Simon Hatherley was declared dead. But if the Covenant practices what it preaches, death is only another kind of rewrite. You believe he lives? I believe someone wants us to believe he lives. He tapped the signature. Note the stylization. M-, name, period. That's the editor's format, used only in internal memos, which means... Colin paled. They're still authoring from within the government. That night, Holmes vanished for 3 hours without explanation. When he returned, his coat was torn and he held a single object. A matchbook from a Soho club called the Green Margin. On its inside flap, for the next chapter, Midnight, Come Alone. Against my protestations, Holmes insisted on going alone. He returned just after 2 a.m., pale and silent. I pressed him for details. He said only, "They showed me the story we would have told had they succeeded. You died in it, Watson, but I kept writing." Colin pieced together another discovery that day. a second ledger, hidden as marginalia in Wetherell's old copy of Macbeth. It was an index of proxy authors, people credited for works they didn't write, dozens of names, entire oeuvres, whole legacies reassigned. Poetry, he said, politics, even science. They weren't erasing ideas, Holmes said. They were consolidating authorship, concentrating influence. I stared at one entry. A paper on electromagnetic resonance. Signed by Maxwell, Colin pointed. Original author, E. Hargreaves. We finally understood the truth. The Inkstone Covenant did not merely want to rewrite lives. They wanted to control authorship itself, to make sure that only select voices shaped the future. They would decide what was written, what was remembered, and what was true. I need to make something clear, Holmes said that evening, as we sat in the lamplight of 221B. This will not end with us uncovering their names. It will only end when we make the world remember those they erased. I met his eyes. And if we fail... Holmes looked away. Then in a generation there will be no Sherlock Holmes, no Watson, no Wetherell, just names replaced, and someone else telling our story. The first snowfall of the season dusted the streets of London with the faintest illusion of purity, masking beneath it a city rotting at its narrative core. It was on that cold December morning that Holmes received the summons that would alter the course of everything, delivered not by post nor by messenger but by typewriter in the middle of our study table. Neither of us had seen who left it. Holmes unfolded the note. The original author invites you to the final reconciliation. Location, Houghton Library, sealed wing. Time, midnight. No edits shall follow. Houghton Library was known only to a few in the Ministry of Culture. Officially it was closed to the public. Unofficially it was home to books too dangerous, too disputed, or too powerful to reside in circulation. We went armed, Holmes with his revolver and the editor's dagger, I with my pen and pistol. Colin carried the last draft beneath his coat like scripture. We arrived at 11:57. An archivist met us at the side entrance, nodded without a word, and led us past wards and wards of locked glass cases until we reached a black iron door marked only with a single character. Not 0, not O, but the glyph used by the Covenant to signify blank authorship, a space where no name yet resides. The door opened of its own accord. Inside stood a circular chamber, lit from above by a shaft of moonlight, filtered through stained glass shaped like an open eye. Books lined the walls, but more than that, portraits, each one captioned. Some had names, others were blurred. A few had been scratched out entirely. And in the centre, behind a desk made of dark oak, sat a figure clad in a charcoal grey suit, hair white as ash, his eyes like flecks of ink. The original author, Holmes said under his breath. The man smiled. You've come far, Mr. Holmes. Farther than any, including the ones I created. Created? I said. The man looked at me with interest. Dr. Watson, the heartbeat, the observer, the last custos not yet overwritten. He gestured to the shelves. All of this exists because of a single idea. That story is power. That authorship determines perception. That if you control the narrative, you control the world. Holmes stepped forward. You are Hatherley. I was Hatherley, he replied, before I rewrote myself. The original author stood. Would you like to know the truth? He walked to a glass case and opened it. Inside lay a manuscript titled simply, The World. The covenant began as a safeguard, he said, to protect fragile truths in fragile times. But eventually, protection turned to curation, then correction, then invention. He looked directly at me. You've spent your life writing Holmes into memory, into legend, into permanence. Holmes's fists clenched. And you've spent yours deciding who gets remembered. The author inclined his head. Exactly, and now I offer you the same pen. Silence. Then he lifted the lid of the manuscript. Blank pages, thousands of them. You may write your version, he said. Holmes survives. Watson remains. The covenant dissolves. You two become eternal. He gestured to the desk. One of you simply needs to sign. Holmes did not move, neither did I. Colin, shaking, spoke first. This isn't preservation, this is possession period. Holmes turned to the author. You offer immortality, but it is counterfeit, hollow. You'll fade, the author warned. You'll be forgotten in a generation. Holmes smiled coldly. Then let us be forgotten honestly. The author sighed and returned to his desk. A pity. He pressed a hidden switch beneath it. At once the room's lights shifted. Portraits on the walls began rewriting themselves. I watched in horror as my own likeness blurred and reformed. With a new name, Thomas Winthrop. My biography twisted. My war record vanished. My published stories replaced by apocrypha. Holmes turned to me. Write it, Watson. Write us, period. Colin threw open the last draft. I can anchor you, he shouted, but it has to be now. I drew my notebook. Ink trembled on the page as I wrote, Sherlock Holmes refused the pen. John H. Watson bore witness to the truth. Neither accepted fiction as fate. The portrait screamed. Holmes lunged at the desk. The dagger plunged into the manuscript titled The World. A blast of ink erupted like smoke. The author staggered backward, bleeding words from his mouth. Fools, you think reality will accept this? Holmes stood over him. No, he said, but truth will. Colin raised the last draft. Its pages ignited, not in flame, but in light. One by one, the rewritten portraits burned clean. My name returned. Holmes's gaze became sharp again. And the author was gone, vanished between one heartbeat and the next. Only the desk remained. Empty. We left the chamber in silence. Outside, the snow still fell, London unchanged, and yet somehow restored. Back at Baker Street, Holmes lit his pipe. Well, Watson, he said, they say history is written by the victors. I nodded, finishing the last sentence of my notebook. Yes, I said, but this time the victors refused to write it. The weeks that followed were eerily calm. London's heartbeat resumed its old rhythm, its crimes petty, its rumours mundane, its newspapers once again free of phantom names and fictional histories. Yet Holmes was uneasy. He moved like a man who had survived a great fire, but could still smell the smoke. They'll return, he said more than once, in different names under new titles. But the urge to control the story, to shape truth, that is not easily killed. I published our account. In a quiet journal few read. No acclaim followed, no scandal broke. But something shifted. Old records previously missing began to resurface. Names thought lost returned in census books, letters and memoirs. Colin Wetherell received his grandfather's real medals, forwarded anonymously from an archivist in Cambridge. "I exist again," he whispered. Holmes simply nodded. "You always did. Now the world remembers." One morning I awoke to find Holmes not at home. On the mantel, a single envelope. "Gone to write a different chapter. Don't wait up." Shh. I searched every corner of London. No sign. Colin too had disappeared. Only silence remained. Months passed, and then on a rainy Thursday Mrs. Hudson handed me a parcel. Unmarked. Inside, a book, bound in plain blue leather. No title, no author. Just one inscription to the one who remembered what they tried to forget. C.W. I opened it. The pages contained every overwritten life. A catalogue of the stolen. Some were familiar, others utterly unknown. But all of them were true. I added one final page. Sherlock Holmes, detective, resister, narrative anarchist. John H. Watson, custodian of the unwritten. Their story was never fiction, it was freedom. I sealed the book, and I buried it, not in soil, but in memory, in every copy of every case I had ever written, in the margins, in the pauses, in the rhythm of my pen. I buried it where they'd never find it, because they weren't looking in the right places. Holmes always said that the truth is like a footprint in fog. It fades quickly, but not if someone keeps walking. So I walk, and I write, and as long as I do, we are not gone, we are not forgotten, we are not rewritten.